at the Catholic University of America, the only pontifical university in North America. We're a very proud heritage, and the Institute for Human Ecology has established this MA in Human Rights, headed by Bill Saunders, a great veteran of a legal veteran who has really worked his whole life on human rights. And so tonight we're going to talk about the purpose of the MA in Human Rights and why you're right to be interested in it, why you're right to understand its relevance for today. Tell you a little bit about the curriculum, to tell you a little bit about what we think are the professional advantages that an MA in Human Rights gives you, especially in DC, where the government the federal government is rooted in, and also in our concern for your education and what you'll do with it and how you'll be formed as a thinker. So if you have questions that you want to ask as we go along, we just ask that you type them in to the chat function. Go to the webinar panel at any time that either Bill or myself are talking, and we will try to answer those questions either at the end or if we can as we're going. This video will be available on our website following this presentation. It's being recorded right now. And so those of you who are not attending live will be able to benefit from the discussion. So my first question is really over to Bill, to ask Bill, my friend, why a graduate program in human rights?
Well, Chad, look, first of all, thanks to everybody who's here at the webinar, and thank you, Chad, for being involved in it. I mean, I'll talk about this in a minute, but one of the great things about our program is it's an interdisciplinary program, which means it draws from different schools at Catholic University, and it draws different professors who are associated with the Institute for Human Ecology, including Chad. So we very much appreciate you being on the call, but also being involved in the program. But the reason that we started this program, as Chad mentioned, I've been involved in human rights myself for, 25 years or more, and I've been involved in a variety of ways. I've fought against genocide in various places. We can talk about that. I've been a pro-life lawyer. I've fought for religious freedom around the world. But I've been involved in these issues of public policy for a long time. And what I noticed was it was a very impoverished conversation about human rights. And that usually nowadays it's so undisciplined that people will simply assert whatever they want as a right. Now, that's academically indefensible, but it also has real world consequences, because the whole idea of human rights has been really undermined, and a lot of serious people don't even believe the concept is viable anymore, but I do. And not only do I think it's viable, I think it's essential, because what human rights being translated, or another way of putting it, is the dignity of the human person. So this program, our MA in Human Rights, is all about equipping students to go out into the world in a variety of different ways and to make a intelligent, informed contribution to this conversation. So that's what we wanted to do. And we particularly, of course, this is what the Institute for Human Ecology is all about. And about this program is Catholic social thought. So it is a view of human rights that is usually, I have found, lacking in the public conversation, and therefore the public conversation is impoverished, and would benefit greatly to have people who can talk about human rights informed by Catholic social thought. So that's why we're doing it.
I mean, in a way, rights, I mean, yes, there's a classical heritage for rights, but in a way, rights is a particularly Catholic idea. What is it about Catholic University of America that makes our MA in human rights distinctive? What makes it stand out from, say, a secular university's program in human rights?
Well, ours is the only one that I know of, at least in the United States, that benefits from this Catholic perspective. Most human rights programs, or every one I know about, is basically a secular program or a positivistic program. It doesn't pay much attention to natural law, which we do in the program. Other programs don't pay any attention to theological perspectives, which we do in our program. Other programs don't pay attention to Catholic social thought or papal teaching, which we do in our program. In fact, of course, one of the courses is yours in Christian anthropology. And I believe John Paul II was the biggest influence on me personally, but I think he had a great influence on the world in talking about, if you indulge me for a second, as a lawyer, this is just a book of legal documents and treaties and declarations. And a lot of times people are skeptical about those. But what happened in the Second World War was, and I don't know if everybody knows this, sometimes people are not as well educated in history as they should be, but the whole world suffered in the Second World War. We had over 50 million non-combatants killed. So over 50 million non-soldiers killed. And after the Second World War, the United Nations was founded. Of course, that's a separate question about criticisms we may have of the United Nations, but it was founded on the idea that to avoid a third world war, we needed to respect human rights. And so it issued various documents, one called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the kind of modern human rights project came out of the Second World War, and it's a series of legal documents. But as any lawyer will tell you, the text alone may need explanation, or you may need to delve into it. So John Paul II, when he came along with his pontificate in 1979, the first thing he did in his encyclical Redemptor Hominis was to talk about human rights, not alone, but he talked about that. And he was the great pope who redeemed the Human Rights Project, I think, by insisting that it was a reflection of the dignity of the human person, and of course from a Catholic perspective or a Christian perspective, made in the image and likeness of God. And he proposed an understanding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a list of about 26 rights, without an explanation, because you couldn't get a complete explanation even after the Second World War. He proposed an explanation founded in Christian anthropology, natural law, Christian social thought. And that, I think, is what we need to do today. So that's what we try to do in the program. We want to propose an understanding of human rights that can help the world to think more deeply about human rights.
That is to say that human rights are really rooted in the idea of human dignity.
Right. Yep.
And if you want a proper understanding or proper basis for human dignity, it's hard not to have some appeal to God, right? That human dignity, you could say, well, it's rooted in our being rational by nature, but why are we rational by nature? What makes us rational? The dignity which accrues to us as human persons is the dignity which accrues to us as images of God. So it seems like the program has an intrinsic premise, that human dignity is rooted in the Imago Dei.
Yeah, Chad, and just responding to what you were saying a second ago, and to follow up on that, I mean, our program, what distinguishes it from any other one in the United States is it has the Catholic perspective.
Yeah.
And you can't get that anywhere else that I know of in the United States. So
I notice you talk about Saint Josephine as the patron of the program. That's unusual to have a patron for a Masters of Arts. Why is that? Why did you choose a patron for the Masters of Arts program?
Well,
Josephine, why did you choose it?
Yeah, I've actually got this pamphlet or little booklet about her. And for anybody listening in who doesn't know her, it's St. Josephine Bikina. And she was from Sudan. I have a real close connection to her. In fact, in the back of this pamphlet is a picture of her canonization in Rome, and I was there for that.
Wow.
It's the only canonization I've ever been to, but I was there for her. As I mentioned, I worked against genocide, and of course, I founded an organization that worked in the Sudan, and we documented atrocities, we worked for political change, and we raised money. But when I first started going over to Sudan, I would hear people, and they would be ordinary folks, and they'd be talking about Blessed Bikina, because she hadn't been canonized at the time. And I didn't know anything about her, but her life is incredible. She was a slave. She had been enslaved. And she ended up, she was kidnapped when she was a 9-year-old child, and she eventually ended up in Italy. And she came in contact with a religious order, and she refused, when her owners wanted to take her back to Sudan, she refused to go. And she became a member, the doorkeeper of this order, and she became a great saint. So to me, her entire story is a story about human rights and human dignity. And she's an inspiration for me. Also, I just want to show this, because for those who are Catholics and maybe have read the encyclicals of some of the popes, this is Benedict XVI's encyclical on Christian hope. And he begins in the first section of this encyclical, he talks about the meaning of hope. And he roots it in the example of Bikina. So it's a fantastic story, because what does Bikina mean? It was a name given to her by her the people who had kidnapped and enslaved her, because she was so traumatized she couldn't tell them her name. So they called her Fortunate One, which was a kind of a cruel irony, to give as a name to her. But she says herself, in God's providence, it was, she got to know the Lord, and she was fortunate. So she's an incredible figure and a great saint, and I hope and pray that her influence and her prayers for us will help this program to raise up the dignity of the human person, so things like what had happened in Sudan will not go unchallenged.
Yeah. So that actually, when we think about fighting for human dignity, fighting for women who are enslaved, right? We think maybe St. Josephine, she's what, early 20th century or late 19th century? But there are women enslaved today, and sex trafficking, and there's a St. Josephine Bikina still out there right now.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep,
absolutely. And so the special thing that I think Catholic University can do in shaping people, forming people's minds and understanding of human rights is precisely with this perspective. Theological depth, spiritual depth, philosophical depth, historical depth. It's when I think about an MA program that has a patron saint, I think we're dealing with a very unusual and special MA program. I'm very very proud to teach students in your program. Now that's in a sense on the theological, spiritual side of having a kind of theocentric perspective, right? But what about, come on, people do MAs for professional advantage, right? What about, how does this, let's say I'm a young Christian on the Hill or something like that, and I want this as something to help me advance as well. I love your program, but I want to know how this will actually help me in my career.
Well, like you said, when we started, this is a new program. We've been going on. We have our first class of students currently. So some things will be unveiled as time goes on. But in my view, the way this would help anybody, if you're concerned about human rights, you can be a voice in the conversation, like you indicated, on Capitol Hill. I mean, which is for those who are not in Washington, that's what we call the Congress. That's called the Hill. And for people, there's lots of committees and staffs, and there's the State Department, which is not on Capitol Hill, but it's also in Washington. There's state governments. There's dioceses around the country. There's the Conference of Catholic Bishops. There are NGOs from the Red Cross to Catholic Relief Services, some Catholic, obviously, some not. There are humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations. And in all of these places, to have a master's, it helps you to advance. But to have the Catholic perspective is to add something in the conversation that's not there otherwise. So we expect our people to get jobs in those various kinds of organizations. But I just want to add one other thing, which is I also think, and I've talked to other people, that many companies, corporations, are concerned about human rights and what they call the human rights footprint, what kind of impact they have by their activities in various countries around the world. And companies are beginning to have offices and staff devoted to this human rights question. So I actually think people who even go into, they also could go into, I suppose, to even academia, but who go into private businesses and stuff, I think there's a role for somebody who's educated in that program in that as well.
What about, so there's the positive dimension of advancing genuine human right. The right to life, for example, which is a universal right rooted in our nature, our right to exist. But what about when we come up against rights which aren't really rights? And I'm thinking about certain kinds of organizations which are almost solely dedicated to an idea of human rights that is, like what you said earlier, just rights rooted in desire, rights rooted in what I want to be the case and what I have enough power to secure. What is it about this program that equips people to, in a sense, come into confrontation with false views of human rights and false accounts of rights?
Yeah, I think that, some of it is the coursework they'll get in things like natural law, so that they'll be able to think about rights in a more disciplined way. We do also, let me just say for those who are tuning in don't know a lot about the program. So it's interdisciplinary. So it draws on 5 schools at Catholic University, one of which is the School of Philosophy, one is the School of Theology and Religious Studies, where you are, Chad. There's also the School of Arts and Sciences that draws on the Department of Politics. We also canon law and the law school. So just today, for instance, I've been speaking with people at the law school about some of the courses that we're going to have next year. So somebody who's coming into the program will get an understanding of the international political legal structure, because I think that's very important, at least for what we're doing, which is to equip you for public policy discussion in the public square. So a conversation about rights, I think, is enriched by knowledge of these legal documents I was talking about, and understanding of human rights in that context, which our courses at the law school do. And also, so in other words, in America, law school is a very disciplined school. As a lawyer, I know that it really trains you to think clearly in a disciplined way. So my point is, our courses at the law school, as well as philosophy and other courses, teach them to think in a disciplined way about rights. And I believe that will equip them to contend in various arenas. By the way, I want to mention, we also have in this program a former Vatican diplomat named Monsignor Anthony Frontero. And many years ago, I was actually on the U.S. delegation to the UN, United Nations, and I worked with Monsignor Frontero, or not directly with him, but he was at the Holy See, so he represented the Vatican at the UN. And so he's a very experienced diplomat. So another arena in which people can consider is diplomatic work, and that could be on behalf of whatever country they work for. They're from. One of the biggest difficulties on human rights is that in some of these international fora, human rights are not, they're not dealt with in a disciplined way, so that certain things can be asserted as human rights, get into the documents that come out of these UN meetings, and there's a danger that they become part of, at least arguably part of international law, which is very dangerous for anyone who believes in things like the right to life. So I've been contesting that, Monsignor Frontero is, and I think our students will be equipped to do the same thing.
I mean, it gives the program a kind of unique matrix of connections, both to Capitol Hill and also to not only the Catholic Church generally, but to the Vatican and the whole diplomatic corps. The Vatican runs the oldest, greatest diplomatic corps in the world, and in a sense, you get two different spheres of influence. What about the networking opportunities that an MA in Human Rights at Catholic University gives you?
Yeah, that is a great advantage, I think, to our program. Again, if the program isn't located in Washington, D.C., you don't have the advantage of some of these possibilities like Capitol Hill or the State Department, or most non-governmental organizations have their headquarters here. But beyond that, part of the benefit of my work for all these years in human rights is that I have a quite extensive network of contacts and people I've worked with over the years. So we bring those people in to meet with the students, to talk to the students. They're available to help students think about what they want to do. For instance, we had a priest who, not a Roman Catholic, well, an Eastern Catholic priest who was an official for the Canadian government on religious liberty. We brought him in one day to talk to the students. We brought in Robert George. By the way, let me mention, not only is this program, I think, benefited by having faculty like Chad, but it's also benefited by having an incredible advisory board, which includes Robert George, who I'm sure almost everybody knows is a professor.
For those of us that don't know, who is Robert George?
Well, I think it's not too much to say he's one of the leading Catholic intellectuals in the world, and he is a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University and the founder of the James Madison program and American ideals and principles, and somebody I actually worked with for 25 years. And so he's on my advisory board. He's a leading public intellectual. He met with the students. He's always available to help the students. Some of the people on this call probably heard about this call from him tweeting out about this event. So he's a great, great friend of the program. Another person on the advisory board that I hope everybody who's interested in human rights has heard about is Marianne Glendon. She is a Harvard Law School professor of human rights. She is a dear friend as well. She is currently the chairman of the State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, which is looking at human rights. And I was thrilled to be able to take my students to their meetings in the spring and to meet Professor Glendon and the other people who are on the commission. I also just mentioned it, well, before I forget it, I have this book that's come out on, you can see it's called Unborn Human Life and Fundamental Rights. The reason I mention it is I dedicated it to Marianne Glendon. So she is another one who's a great champion, and her approach is very similar to what I said before about taking the legal landscape that came out of the Second World War, realizing what a great thing that is because the world agreed on something about the importance of human rights and a basic framework, and then valuing that, offering, as John Paul II does, a deeper explanation of rights to help the world think more deeply about them. But so the point is there's an incredible network of people here in Washington that my students can meet with and who I will bring in to meet with the students specifically, or even to speak to us in our capstone class in the second semester, which pulls together all the insights from these different courses to try to help students get a coherent understanding of rights from the Catholic perspective.
Tell us more. That's terrific. I mean, you can see that you're not just getting the sort of connections that are lateral, but also these vertical connections to people of real influence from Harvard and Princeton who are on important commissions, who can help guide students as they advance in influence and learning. Could you tell us a little bit more about that book that you held up? Because that seems like an important book.
Well, it's a project I've worked on for quite a while with a professor from Spain, and it looks at fundamental rights, particularly the right to life around the world, and it has essays from various important professors. I'm very proud, you can't see it probably, but I'm very proud of the fact that we have a special concluding essay by John Finnis, who
great Oxford legal scholar.
Yeah, I think he's a leading legal philosopher in the world. And so we looked at countries in North America, South America, and Europe, and looked at the protection of the right to life under the law, and particularly cases in the constitutional courts, and tried to analyze what was going on. So, it's a picture that has big challenges in it because there is a lot of sliding in the wrong direction abetted by the courts, but not founded on any really coherent understanding of the constitutions involved. I mean, we go through various cases to show how shallow a lot of the reasoning is. It's not just for lawyers, it's for people of, anybody who's interested in, I mean, it's not, it's not a light reading, but it's not just for lawyers. So it's part of what we're trying to do in the program.
In that sense, you see the arguments really are on the side of defending human life, and those who are working at cross purposes to human life really don't have good arguments. And so what we need is to equip a generation with the good arguments that can go and knock down these kind of straw men that get built up in legal decisions and legislative decisions. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would say personally, when I sum up Catholic social thought, which is you can't do, but I mean, just for the purposes of this webinar, I think that, again, this is John Paul II, but the first right's the right to life, the first freedom's religious freedom, and the family should be the center of any and all social policy. So I think those are kind of foundational stones in what we're doing, but it's not, obviously what we're doing is not catechetics, it's not training people for religious education, but it's thoroughly informed by Catholic social thought. And I think one thing that's sadly neglected are a lot of the encyclicals, particularly of John Paul II, but of others. So we look at all those sources. We don't, the students have to think these things through and form their own perspectives after having considered all this. But certainly, from the Catholic perspective, the right to life is the fundamental right.
And in a sense, it's unique to study human rights at a Catholic university where the Catholic view not only defends perennial philosophical positions on justice, but also has 2,000 years of its own reflection on justice, its own reflection on human dignity. And so you get something that you don't get at any other university, and you don't get mentors like you who have really fought the good fight for so many years. How did you personally, wind up with a passion for human rights?
Well, I think like you are, Chad, I'm a convert. And I came into the church, particularly around the time, or under the influence, or not, kind of beginning to read John Paul II. And I was very interested in religious liberty, even though, just as I was interested in human rights as having been a lawyer, or being a lawyer. And I was interested in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights and those things. And I was working in human rights field when I met a bishop who, needed help in the Sudan. So this is the work we begin to do in the Sudan. And through that, I just, I would say anybody who's not passionate about human rights, but who encounters a situation where people are literally being enslaved. We interviewed for this film people who had been slaves, little children who had escaped, really 6, 7, 8-year-old children, women who had escaped. So you meet people like that, and you see people who are being killed through a program of genocide, and you see that the one thing they have is their faith, and that is all they have. It's very moving. It's very deeply moving. And you just want to try to find ways to, to respond to that. So that's what happened to me. As I was coming into church, John Paul II was Pope, and I started working in the Sudan or in human rights, and encountered the situation in the Sudan. And genocide is just an example of not protecting the right to life for a large group of people. It's the same basic issue.
Just for those of us who don't know, what was the cause of the Sudanese genocide? Who were the main actors? What was happening?
Well, there was a radical Islamic government who was trying to force people in the country to buy their view of Islam, and was willing to kill people who didn't. And one of the areas in which I worked was called the Nuba Mountains, and it had communities of Muslims, Christians, and followers of traditional African religion, but they very much respected one another, and under the genocidal pressure, they actually became closer to one another. And then they were using slavery as a instrument of public policy in the southern part of Sudan to try to break down and subjugate the black African tribes. So this, and at the time, nobody was paying attention to it. So frankly, one of the reasons I mention it for the people listening in is this is an example of something you can do. So my story is just an example for you of what you can do. I got deeply moved by what was going on in Sudan. I formed a non-governmental organization and just responded to the situation. We started raising money, and we started raising the issue politically, and eventually, we were able to help. But that was just because I encountered this situation of great injustice and was moved to do something about it. So everybody listening to this, that's not beyond you. I mean, part of this is to help you, and part of the reason to talk to the people that we bring in to meet with students from Washington, D.C. and stuff, is for you to be thinking, and as you're exploring human rights, thinking about, well, this is how X has done this, and Y has done this, and this is the issue, and then maybe you discover what your calling is. That's what we hope.
Somebody asked a good question in the chat, which is the program more about the framework questions, the big human flourishing questions, or is it more about the particular, particular rights and infringements against human rights in the international fora from a Catholic perspective? And it seems like you're saying yes to the question, both. You need both the framework. You need a framework perspective and this program that gives you multiple school perspectives, philosophy and law and theology. And this gives you the framework, but it also lets you kind of look at particular issues, how you worked in the Sudan, how the fight for religious freedom works in the United States, how the right to life works in Brazil. All of these things go together.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Chad. I mean, you've got to have framework, but so the program itself is interdisciplinary, draws on 5 schools to give you, the philosophical, theological, law, political science understandings, and international relations perspectives on human rights. And then we have a capstone course which draws everything together with Monsignor Frontero and I are teaching this year. But in addition to that are these people I bring in to enrich the students' experience, and so they can meet people who are actually working in these areas. But yeah, it's a framework. It's a master's program. It's a disciplined graduate program.
How long is it?
It's 1-year program. It's 30 credit hours. I'll just say a word about. We have it. It's at the Catholic University of America. We were able to get a special rate for the program, so special tuition. So it's much less than ordinary graduate tuition. It's about $1,000 a credit hour, a little slightly over that. But we do have scholarships, partial merit scholarships that can reduce the cost even more.
So 2 semesters and at a reduced rate and possibly some scholarship money. So you're giving 2 semesters of your life, but you're getting a kind of intensive master's program that really can launch you into a lot of different arenas.
Yeah, Chad, one of the things in my own thinking, again, I'm a lawyer, so I went to, I obviously went to law school. Law school in America, because I know we have some people who are interested who are not in the United States, but in America, it takes 3 years and it's very expensive. So that's a lot of people are interested in public policy. It's law and public policy or whatever, but they can't do law school. They're not interested in actually being just a lawyer. So our program is partially a response to that. We want to help people, first of all, have an enriched perspective that is not just the law, but includes the law, but also can be completed in a year, and it doesn't put them in debt for the rest of their lives, but allows them to participate in the public conversation.
There, in most programs, there's usually a combination of core courses that everybody takes and the electives. Is that true with the MA in Human Rights here as well?
It is. It is. We, as I said a minute ago, next year will be our second year. So, but we have 5 core courses in the fall, and then in springtime we have 3 courses with 2 electives. That has to be slightly adjusted for various reasons, but that's our basic structure. So the students come in, and the intention behind this is to form what we call a cohort. So the students know each other, they take the same classes, the professors get to know them as a group. I was just talking to a law professor on Monday who said it was very valuable. He thought that they were a cohort who knew each other, and other students realized who they were, and the professors realized who they were. So we have orientation before the semester starts. So they're in it together, and it's a great experience for them, I think. So they have core classes and then electives in the spring. Part of the idea for that, of course, is you get exposed to some of these ideas that you may not know much about. And so during this first semester, when we're covering a lot of these different subject areas like theology, philosophy, law, you may start to think, well, I'm particularly interested in this aspect of human rights. So in the second semester, you'll have a chance to take an elective or 2 where you can pursue that.
Mm-hmm. Are there like particular tracks, for lack of a better term, kind of ways in which you can customize the program for your own particular interests?
Well, they're not defined tracks like I don't know, maybe law and human rights. There's not something like that, but you can pursue it, I think, through these electives and also through the papers you write. For instance, in the capstone course, the major part of the grade and everything is a paper you write. And the purpose of the paper is to draw these insights together on a topic that interests you in the field of human rights. So there are opportunities to do that, but they're not tracks as such.
Now, obviously, you have to have a college degree to get into the program. Are there other requirements to get into the MA?
Yeah, I assume people listening have been to the webpage, but if you haven't, it's MA, like Master of Arts, mahumanrights.com, where you can get more of this information. You can apply to the program, but the requirements include, of course, you've got to be a college graduate. If you're an international student, of course, you have to have equivalence of these things. You have to fill out the application form. We have sometimes the GRE test, which can be waived in certain circumstances. You have to tell me why you want to come into the program. We have to have an interview, etc. And for non-English speakers, you have to satisfy graduate requirements at Catholic University generally for things like what's called a TOEFL test to make sure your English fluency is good enough for graduate studies. So those are the basic requirements.
Do you have now? I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that you are the admissions committee. Do you have an ideal student that you think about as you are reviewing applications?
Well, Yes, to a certain extent, you have to be excited about this idea, which is learning about human rights from the Catholic perspective. I think that's as long as you are able to do the work, so you have to, have good grades and all that, which you have to for any graduate program. The main thing is I want to see if you have a vision here, and I don't mean it has to be precisely the same as mine, because I think every one of the students kind of enriches and expands what we're trying to do, but just that the perspective is, this is what you want to study. So our distinctives are something that you're really interested in. And then when I have an interview with you, we'll talk about that in more depth.
Now you're kind of describing the traditional student who, takes the year, comes to Catholic U, and just is full-time. What about maybe somebody who works on Capitol Hill, who's got to work from 9 to 5? Is there a possibility for them to do the program in any way, or is that not really a possibility?
Well, I think it's possible. That's not the situation so far, but I will say sometimes people who are already working in certain jobs, they're allowed to take a year of study or whatever. So that's one of the advantages for having a program that can be done in a year. If you're out of whatever it is you're doing just for a year. But right now, all our students have been full-time. I'm certainly willing to do the part-time option if we can. It would take a lot longer. That's the problem. So our program is mainly geared for somebody who wants to get it, get the studying done and get on with it after a year. But we certainly are open to people who are working, who want to, particularly kind of mid-career people, or people who want to shift a bit or enrich what they're doing. For instance, you could be working at a nonprofit organization, and they encourage you to get a graduate degree, and they work with you to do that.
I remember having a student who worked for the UN, and he worked for World Bank, part of the UN. He worked for World Bank, and his employer had a program in which my seminars were like from, 1240 to 210 or something. And his employer said, yeah, go off from 1240 to 210. That's valuable to us. So I think people are sometimes surprised to find out that their employers are actually happy to give them the time for doing that sort of thing. So for those who might be restricted in that way, they should talk to their employer to see if something might work out in that regard.
Yeah, I just want to also say, Chad, that just for the people listening, that look, we're still accepting applications. You can always reach out to me. My email is right there on the webpage I gave you, or in the other materials, emails you may have gotten from the Institute. I'm happy to talk to you. If you're interested in doing it in the fall, like I say, we're still accepting applications. The final deadline for international student is July the 1st. For an American student is actually the middle of July, but I wouldn't advise anybody to wait that long because, among other things, the scholarship money will not last that long. So,
are you making
not too late? But I wouldn't keep waiting to get started.
Are you making now? That's when will people, if people have applied, when could they expect to hear about their entry?
Well, it's rolling admissions process, so pretty promptly.
Right, pretty promptly. That's great. Now, the program's pretty new. I have thoroughly enjoyed teaching the students who have come in. Do you have a sense of where students are going to after they finish this year? Do you have a sort of success stories of already placing people after only being open 2 years?
Well, it's still in process, and it's interesting. I mean, one of the students is actually going to go to further graduate work. One is going into the U.S. Navy. One is looking at currently, two of them are looking for public policy jobs. One of them is working at a nonprofit and is going to either continue there or work for another nonprofit. So the fact is, a couple of these students now are also working part-time, which is, I'm not sure I could have done that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I couldn't have done that because it's so demanding. But so some people are enhancing a job they already have. So we're in the process of placing them. I mean, it's, I believe that we'll be successful in that. One of the other things is having these connections in the government and networks. You know, you can help people find jobs through those.
Do you think the Catholic brand, if I can put it that way, disadvantages our students from certain jobs, or is it, you know, because I can imagine a certain kind of approach to human rights that looks at the Catholic as an enemy, right? I mean, frankly, not everybody takes our view of human rights as their view.
Yeah, I think
right.
Sorry, Jim. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think you're right, and I think any student, you know, coming in, you know, you have to think this over. I mean, I'm unapologetic in my perspective on this, but you know, yeah, of course, a lot of secular, particularly, you know, viewpoints that consider Catholicism to be a form of superstition or whatever, and there are a lot of those people in the world, but you shouldn't let that daunt you. I mean, you have to go forth. Somebody who wouldn't hire you because you studied from a Catholic perspective human rights, I don't know why you'd want to work for them. I mean, they're the problem. I mean, so I don't doubt that it could be an issue, but why you would want a job with someone like that is beyond me. And of course, you know, you can go to a secular human rights program, but that's not our program. Our program is from the Catholic perspective. And it's not just, like I say, it's not like Sunday school class. We're not just telling you stories from the Bible, but we're giving you the deep philosophical, theological, historical perspective to supplement the legal and political perspectives. So I think it enriches, but you know, you have to ask whether it's for you or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, if you come to the program, you want to own the Catholic identity of the program and to be the kind of person in the world who says the Catholic ought to be the smartest person in the room, you know, on these questions. The Catholic ought to be the person who actually knows more than anybody else, who actually understands the arguments of those who have bad arguments about human rights, right? And can respond to them with better arguments, true arguments. And in that sense, I think you're absolutely right. You don't want to worry about those who are actively biased against Catholics. You don't want to work for an anti-Catholic, but you do want to work for somebody who just isn't sure, right?
Sure.
And I don't think the Catholic brand hurts you at Senator so-and-so's office or at World Bank or, you know, places where we do have serious disagreements. I mean, the Vatican seems to be very concerned about problems at the UN and issues of development that, you know, are running contrary to the right to life, for example. But we need people at the UN who actually have the better arguments, who aren't Malthusians, who are happy to snuff out human life. So we actually need those who aren't ashamed to be Catholic, who aren't ashamed to be in a program that is going to run sometimes very contrary to secular accounts of human rights.
Yeah, you know, and we need people who are going to have disciplined thinking. I mean, again, we're not saying, you know, you just go up and say, well, this is a human right because Pope so-and-so said it. I mean, that may be a truthful perspective, but what we're expecting you to do is to be able to sit down in a room and make the case based on law, philosophy, and if they're open to it, a theological perspective. But if they're not, you don't have, like John Paul II, you don't have to knock anybody over the head. But if there's an opportunity to propose a deeper one, you say, you know, you can give your perspective. So I think, you know, one thing in our classes, you'll have had some law school classes, you know, you'll have had professors who can say, you know, this was not a class just for people who are going to teach religious education. This was a law school class, and these people are first rate. So I wouldn't worry about that.
Bill, we've just got a few minutes left. Do you have any sort of last pitch to anybody who's interested in the program?
Well, the only thing I would say, Chad, is my view, and all the people listening can tell me whether they agree or not, but I think the human rights is what we would call the lingua franca of our age. It is the language of most people in the world. Most people in the world, if you stopped them on the street and you said, what do you think about human rights, or what do you think about so-and-so, they would use the language of human rights. And I think that's a great opportunity, not a bad thing, because you can enter into that conversation and say, I agree with you about human rights, and then start to unpack what that means. And like you said earlier, it's about the dignity of the human person. And if somebody says, oh gosh, I don't want to talk about abortion, fine. You don't have to talk about abortion. Any issue of public policy is going to have to be rooted in the dignity of the human person. So you're going to have to think about, what is a human person? Why do we care about a human person? If you're a slave in Sudan, does that mean you don't have human rights? And if not, is it because of the color of your skin, or because you're poor, or because you don't have political power? I mean, we're about all of those things in the Catholic perspective. So we're defending slaves, their human dignity, whether they've ever even heard of the Catholic Church. So I think if you believe in the dignity of the human person, and I think everybody does actually in a deeper way, we just want to help you to think deeply about it and then make good arguments. So I think the program will do that for you.
I know there's more questions coming in, but we're out of time. If people want to address you directly and write to you by email, what is your email? How do they reach you, Bill?
Well, I'll tell you my email address, and I'll just remind you that you can find it on the webpage. So my email address is Saunders, which is SAUNDERSWL. So Saunders WL at cua.edu. The webpage is MA, like Master of Arts, mahumanrights.com. And my email address is also on that webpage, so you can reach me through that. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. I thank you to everybody who's attending this information session and who are going to be watching a recorded version of it. Catholic University of America is an absolutely gorgeous place to study and to pray and to live, and I hope we see all of you in the fall.
And only 2 steps from the Congress and the Supreme Court. I mean, 2 subway stops from the Congress and the Supreme Court. So,
right,
we'd be happy to have you.
The greenest campus in DC, and also the most connected campus. So, hope to see you all in the fall. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you, Chad.